learning chess. E4, g6, d4, bishop to g7, knight to f3, d6. Light continues with knight to c3, knight to d7, bishop c4. It's all mainline up to here. Now, bishop c4 isn't always played. Sometimes bishop d3 is played, and sometimes that squared bishop is brought down. So black might know this, might not know what to do in this position, and may develop his knight to f6. In this case, white has won this game. There are a number of ways to win from this position. To name it, one would be to push the e5 pawn, other pawn to e5, but simpler still is just bishop takes f7 check, and the game is over. If the king takes an f7, the knight comes to g5 check, and no matter where the king goes, white is going to win a great deal of material. If the king goes back to e8, it's going to beat knight to e7, trapping the queen. If the king went to f8, and again knight to e6, blocking the king and the queen, and winning the queen. If king went to g8, knight to e6, queen to e7, knight to c7, knight takes c7, sorry, queen to d8, knight takes a8, and then white will be able to rescue his knight. After b5, e5, d takes c5, d takes c5, the white knight will be able to come to d5 and help the knight in a8 out. I'll simply wing the queen up to d5 at a later time. Will also be able to assist and even at the knight and remove his queen to f3. Very briefly, we'll go back and we'll see the other option here, which is if the king doesn't take on f7, we'll simply plays f8, probably the best move in this position. This time the knight comes to g5 as usual, eyeing up the e6 square. The only way to make space for the queen is to play knight to b6, or you can drop the knight back to b3, still eyeing up is the square, the e6 square. After e6, knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6. White, 2 pieces up of the bishop, 2 pawns up of the bishop pair, and should have no problems in converting this into a 4-point. We'll look at 2 more of these pious and modern defenses. We'll look at 1 more this week and 1 next week. This is our second example game in the Pirc defense, where white makes a quick win. Now, I want to point out that all these examples and all these games I'm going through can be found on mega databases, and very often they're played between international masters and grandmasters. So don't think just because these lines look simple that they're only played by amateurs. In fact, that's not true. They're played by people at the highest levels. e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, and this time we're going to bring the knight to f3. Let's split the pawn. On d4, white plays at c3. d5 is played, and what black's going to do here is trying to isolate the d4 pawn and start to exert pressure with his bishop and his queen on the d4 square, and later bring a knight into the attack. E takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to f3 to split that pawn. c5, bishop e3, c takes d4, c takes d4. So although white is better developed, the black player has managed to exert good pressure on the d4 pawn and isolates it. So how should the black player carry on here? Well, the easiest response, and possibly the best response here, is simply to play knight to f6. But many times, the black player may overlook at knight to f6 and try and exert more pressure on d4. d4 cannot easily be defended by the other black pieces. It would take the knight 2 moves to protect the pawn. No pawns to support d4. Knight square bishop is obviously useless. So black player may play knight to h6, hoping to bring the knight to f5 and exert pressure on the d4 square that way. Unfortunately, the black player in playing knight to h6 overlooks a lethal double attack opportunity about white, which is queen c1. White is now threatening to take on both the h6 square and also on ch square. White cannot hold both these pieces, and the position is lost, as black will be a piece down.